And here on this graph, I'd like to kind of show you kind of like where I stand in terms of end time tribulation and pre-tribulation, premillennial kind of viewpoint. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but just as we kind of look at this chart, the next major event that we know in biblical history is going to be the rapture of the church. The rapture of the church is an unsigned event. It's an unsigned event. In other words, there's no signs prior to that the rapture of the church can happen at any moment where the church is taken up to heaven. It says we will meet Christ in the air. That's not the second coming, but that's the rapture of the church that can happen at any moment, and it will happen so quickly. Paul describes it as like the blink of an eye, twinkling of an eye. After that, there will be 7 years of tribulation here on earth. This is truly going to be hell on earth, a taste of hell on earth like we've never experienced before in the history of this world. It'll be a terrible time of devastation, terrible time of destruction. After the tribulation period, there will be the second coming of Christ. And after the 7 years of tribulation, Christ will defeat the Antichrist, which is called Armageddon, and he will set up his 1,000-year millennial kingdom. After the 1,000 years of kingdom here on earth, talks about Satan will have a final rebellion, but then God will destroy him in the lake of fire, and along with all of the people that are his followers, and then God will create, or I would say recreate, the new heavens and the new earth. With that in mind, kind of like walking through the book of Revelations, let's take a look at the last chapter of Revelation. Last chapter, Revelation chapter 22, in verses 6 through 12. And here John is given this vision. The book of Revelation was written by John, his last book that he wrote before he died. He's being exiled on the island of Patmos, and God gives him this vision, this revelation. And this is the last things that he wants us to understand. In Revelation chapter 6 and 7, he says to me, "These words are faithful and true, and the Lord and the God of the spirits of the prophets sent his angel to show to his bondservant the things which must soon take place. And behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed he who heeds the words of the prophecy of this book." Let's stop right there for a second. Jesus said, behold, pay attention. Why? Because Jesus says, I am coming quickly. So the fact that Jesus is coming back quickly, or could happen at any moment, how should this affect us? How should this commitment to the hope of Christ's return change our lives? Jesus Christ is coming back. I am 8 times more certain of Christ's second coming than I am about his first coming. If you believe in Christmas, if you believe Jesus came 2022 years ago, according to our calendar, if you believe he came, you should be 8 times more certain that he's going to come back again. Why? Because there are 8 times more verses about Christ's second coming than about his first coming. Very few verses, especially in the minor prophets and major prophets in the Old Testament, that talk about Christ's first coming. There's a few, for unto us a child is born, for unto us a child is given. I mean, that's talking about Christ's first coming. But the vast majority of verses in the prophets, the major prophets and minor prophets, are actually referring to Christ's second coming. So we should be 8 times more certain of his second coming than about his first. And knowing that Christ could come back at any moment, how should this change our lives? How should this affect us? Well, here in Revelation chapter 22, we see how Christians are to respond to this truth. Number 1, immediate obedience. Immediate obedience. Here it says in verse 7, heed the words of this book, of the imminent return of Jesus Christ. Knowing that Christ could come back at any moment should cause us to be obedient. The anticipation of a life-changing event will have a tremendous effect on our behavior. Verse 6, it says, these words are faithful and true. In other words, whatever God says is true. Whatever God says is true. God said Adam and Eve were going to die. And guess what? They died. God said the world would perish by water during the days of Noah. And guess what? It did. God said Jerusalem would fall. And it did. God said Messiah would come. And he did. God said Christ would be crucified. And he was. And he said Christ would be raised on the third day. And he was. God's record is perfect. And God's future record will be just as perfect as his past record. He has never missed anything before, and he will not miss anything in the future. The Bible says that Christ could come back at any moment. Theologians call this the imminent return of Christ, talking about the rapture can happen at any moment. And this should have a purifying effect on those of us who put our hope in Jesus Christ. In verse 6, it says this must take place shortly. I don't like the word shortly in English. It's actually the Greek word is taki, and it's referring to speed. In other words, it's not talking about in terms of Christ could come back like when John was writing this. It's not talking about in terms of time, but in terms of speed. In other words, when Christ comes back, it's going to happen quickly, at the twinkling of a blink of an eye. And it says that God is patient and long-suffering. And the reason why Christ hasn't come back yet is because he wants others, his chosen, to be saved. But when he does come back, it's going to happen very, very quickly. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, very interesting. During Jesus' day, during the times of the apostles, people didn't believe that Christ was going to come back. And let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 3 really quick. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4, Peter says this, know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, since our fathers have died, all continues just as it was from the very beginning of creation. And here, people are mocking Peter and mocking Christians today, like, hey, Christ hasn't come back before, so Christ isn't ever going to come back. And that kind of argument was kind of ridiculous. It's like a person saying, I'm not going to die because I have never died. And that's kind of like what their argument is, their reasoning. But we know that the reason why Christ hasn't come back yet is because he wants more to come to the saving knowledge of his son, Jesus Christ. We don't know when Christ is coming. In the Bible talks about he's going to come like a thief in the night. We're not sure when that's going to happen. But one thing I do know for sure is that we are 2022 years closer to his return.